Welcome to one of the most unsettling cases recorded in history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1900. The Ozark Mountains stood silent and indifferent as they had for millennia, their ancient ridges concealing secrets in deep hollows and remote valleys. In Washington County, Missouri, where the Big River cuts through limestone bluffs, there stood a structure known locally as Sutton's Crossing. Official maps listed it simply as Bridge Number 27, but residents of the nearest settlement, Irondale, never called it by that designation. To them, it was the Widowmaker, or as documented in several local accounts from the period, the Gateway to Hell. The bridge itself was unremarkable in its construction, a wooden trestle bridge built in 1879 to connect mining operations on opposite sides of a particularly deep gorge. The ravine below plunged nearly 60 feet to the dark waters of the Big River, which flowed with unusual force through this narrow passage. Local geological surveys conducted in 1875 noted the peculiar acoustics of this specific stretch of river. Water passing over submerged rock formations created what one surveyor described as a most unusual reverberation, reminiscent of distant voices in heated conversation. What distinguished this crossing was not its architecture, but the peculiar atmosphere that seemed to envelop it. Travelers reported an unusual silence that descended upon approaching the bridge. Birds ceased their songs. The wind seemed to hold its breath. According to county records from 1888 to 1901, no fewer than 17 incidents were reported on or near the structure. These range from unexplained disappearances to sudden inexplicable behavioral changes in previously stable individuals. The earliest documented case concerned a mail carrier named Thomas Holloway. According to the Irondale Register's edition of May 17, 1888, Holloway was making his regular route when his horse refused to cross the bridge. The animal reportedly became so agitated that it threw its rider before fleeing back toward town. Holloway completed his journey on foot, but complained to several witnesses of a pressure that followed him home. 3 days later, he resigned his position without explanation. Town records indicate he sold his property at a significant loss and relocated to Illinois. No further contact was established. In the summer of 1892, 3 separate incidents occurred within a 6-week period. On June 12th, a local farmer named Ezekiel Morrison reported that while crossing the bridge shortly after sunset, he experienced what he described as a conversation occurring inside my own head, though I could not make out the words. Morrison, by all accounts a temperate man, not given to exaggeration, was sufficiently disturbed by the experience that he subsequently altered his route to market, adding nearly 7 miles to his journey to avoid Sutton's Crossing. On July the 1st, Abigail Waywright, a respected midwife returning from attending a birth in the outlying settlements, was found wandering near the eastern approach to the bridge at approximately 4 in the morning, according to the statement given. To Sheriff Thomas McCready, predecessor to Sheriff Doherty, Mrs. Waywright appeared disoriented and repeatedly asked whether the voices in the wood had sent for her. After a day's rest, she recalled nothing of the incident and expressed confusion when questioned about her remarks. Perhaps most disturbing was the case of William Dyer, a carpenter commissioned to perform repairs on the bridge's western railing. Following minor damage from spring flooding, Dyer worked at the site for 3 consecutive days in late July 1892. On the evening of the 3rd day, he returned to his boarding house in Irondale and, according to his landlady's subsequent statement, sat in perfect silence through the dinner hour, neither eating nor responding to conversation directed at him. The following morning he gathered his tools and returned to the bridge, despite having completed his contracted work. When he failed to return that evening, a search party was organized. they discovered Dyer's tools neatly arranged at the center of the bridge. A partial set of footprints led to the southern railing before disappearing. Despite an extensive search of the river and surrounding areas, no trace of William Dyer was ever found. His case remains one of 27 unsolved disappearances recorded in Washington County between 1879 and 1917. Following these incidents, local authorities posted signs warning travelers not to linger on the bridge, particularly after dark. While no official investigation was conducted, rural disappearances being unfortunately common in the isolated regions of the Ozarks during this period, an unofficial wariness developed among area residents. Those who needed to cross the bridge reported doing so quickly, often with a silent prayer or protective charm. Some refused to cross it alone, regardless of the hour. What truly cemented the bridge's reputation, however, was the incident involving the Mercer family in the winter of 1900. Jacob Mercer, a respected foreman at the nearby Palmer Lead mine, his wife Elizabeth, and his brother Isaiah occupied a modest homestead approximately 1 mile from Sutton's Crossing. According to all accounts, the Mercers were unremarkable in most respects, hard-working, private, and devoutly religious. Jacob had worked at the mine for nearly 15 years, earning a reputation for reliability and steady temperament. Jacob Mercer's personnel file at the Palmer Mine, preserved in the company archives, now housed at the Missouri Historical Society in St. Louis, contains 15 years of performance evaluations. These documents consistently describe him as methodical, even-tempered, and not given to flights of fancy. His supervisor, Harold Whitmore, specifically noted in the annual review dated February 1900 that Mercer remains the most dependable foreman in our employ, demonstrating sound judgment even in crisis situations. The Mercers kept largely to themselves, attending Sunday services at the Methodist Church in Irondale, but otherwise maintaining little social interaction with their neighbors. Elizabeth was known to sell preserves and pickled vegetables at the general store twice monthly, while Isaiah occasionally took odd jobs as a carpenter. Their property, while not large, was well maintained with a vegetable garden, a small orchard of apple trees, and a barn housing 2 milk cows and a team of workhorses. Isaiah Mercer had arrived from Tennessee in the spring of 1900, following the passing of his wife Sarah from tuberculosis. According to correspondence preserved by Elizabeth Mercer's sister, Isaiah had been profoundly affected by his wife's passing, but was finding solace in manual labor and the company of family. He was described by those who encountered him as quiet but courteous, skilled with his hands, and possessing a thoughtful demeanor. The Mercer homestead itself stood on a gentle rise, overlooking a small tributary of the Big River. The main house, constructed in 1885 by Jacob shortly after his marriage to Elizabeth, was a modest 2-story structure built from local oak and limestone. A covered porch wrapped around the eastern and southern sides, providing views of both the approaching road and the distant ridge where Sutton's Crossing was visible as a dark line against the horizon. As winter descended upon the Ozarks that year, bringing with it unusually heavy snowfall, the Mercer household maintained its regular rhythm. Jacob continued his work at the mine, making the daily journey across Sutton's Crossing each morning and evening. Elizabeth tended to domestic matters. Isaiah, who had arrived from Tennessee the previous spring, assisted with household repairs and supplementary income through his woodworking. December 1900 brought particularly harsh weather to the region. According to meteorological records kept by the U.S. Weather Bureau station in Springfield, temperatures remained consistently below freezing from December 7th onward, with snowfall accumulations reaching 18 inches in some areas by mid-month. Travel became increasingly difficult, with many rural residents effectively isolated until conditions improved. The Palmer Lead mine, however, continued operations regardless of weather. The economic significance of the operation to the region meant that work proceeded unless conditions became truly impassable. Jacob Mercer, living relatively close to the mine, but on the opposite side of the river, made his daily crossing of the bridge regardless of conditions. According to mine attendants records, he maintained perfect attendance throughout the early winter period. On December 11, 1900, Jacob Mercer departed for work as usual. The morning was clear but bitterly cold, with temperatures recorded at approximately 15 degrees Fahrenheit. According to Elizabeth's later statement, Jacob left the house at his customary time of 5:30 a.m., carrying a lantern to illuminate his path to the bridge. He expected to return, as always, shortly after the 4 p.m. end of his shift. According to the mine's attendance ledger preserved in the Washington County Historical Society's archives, he performed his duties without incident and left at the customary hour. He was observed by fellow miners walking in the direction of Sutton's Crossing as dusk approached. This would be the last confirmed sighting of Jacob Mercer as the man his colleagues and neighbors had known for years. What occurred on the bridge that evening remains speculative. No witnesses were present to observe Jacob's crossing. What is known is that when he arrived home, approximately 40 minutes later than his usual time, Elizabeth noted a change in his demeanor. According to her subsequent statement to County Sheriff William Doherty, recorded on January 3, 1901, Jacob seemed distant, as though his thoughts were elsewhere. She attributed this to fatigue and the particularly harsh weather conditions. Elizabeth's journal, discovered among her possessions after her eventual departure from the area, provides more detailed observations regarding that evening. Jay returned late today, nearly 5:30. His clothing was covered with more snow than the weather would account for, suggesting he may have fallen or perhaps stood motionless outdoors for some period. When questioned, he explained that he had stopped on the bridge to listen to what he described as the river talking. I suggested he was simply hearing the water moving beneath the ice, but he shook his head and said, "No, it was using words." He took no supper and retired early, claiming exhaustion. Over the following days, subtle alterations in Jacob's behavior became more pronounced. Isaiah Mercer's personal journal, discovered during the subsequent investigation, provides the most detailed contemporary account of these changes. According to entries dated December 12th to 20th, Jacob began to exhibit several concerning behaviors: prolonged silences, loss of appetite, and most notably, a new habit of standing motionless by windows for extended periods, particularly after nightfall. On December 13th, Isaiah noted, "Jay spoke only 12 words today, by my count. When addressed directly, he responds after a noticeable delay, as though returning his attention from somewhere distant. E is concerned, but believes it will pass." On December 14th, the entry reads, "Found Jay standing at the eastern window at 3 a.m., staring in the direction of the bridge. When I inquired if something troubled him, he replied, 'It's clearer at night. The other sounds don't interfere.' He returned to bed at my urging, but seemed reluctant." On December 15th, Isaiah recorded, "Jacob spent 3 hours this evening, staring toward the direction of the bridge." When Elizabeth inquired as to his thoughts, he replied only that he was listening to it calling. When pressed further, he would not elaborate. A particularly troubling entry from December 17th states, "Jay's appetite continues to diminish. He consumed only a few bites at breakfast and nothing at the evening meal. E is increasingly distressed. Of greater concern is that I discovered the back door unlatched this morning, with fresh footprints in the snow leading in the direction of the bridge. The tracks showed no sign of a return journey. Yet Jay was in his bed when the household awoke. I can only conclude he walked to the bridge during the night and returned by some other path." The most significant behavioral shift occurred on December 18th, when Jacob apparently ceased speaking altogether. Isaiah's journal entry from that date reads, J has not uttered a single word today. E is concerned, but attributes his silence to exhaustion from work. I am less convinced. There is something in his eyes that suggests not fatigue, but attention, as though he is constantly listening to something beyond our perception. On December 19th, Isaiah recorded a disturbing development. Discovered J in the barn at midnight using a piece of charcoal to draw on the wooden wall. The markings resembled mathematical equations or geometric patterns of great complexity. When I approached, he quickly obscured the markings and returned to the house, without acknowledgement of my presence. I examined the wall after his departure, but could make no sense of what remained visible. The configurations seemed to incorporate repeated triangular elements arranged in ways that created a disorienting visual effect. By December 20th, Jacob had stopped attending work. The mine's records indicate a message delivered by Isaiah explaining that his brother had fallen ill with winter fever. The Palmer Mine's medical log contains a brief note acknowledging receipt of this message and approving a 5-day absence, with the expectation that documentation from a physician would be forthcoming if the illness persisted beyond this period. Elizabeth's journal entry from December 21st expresses escalating concern. J has now spent 2 days in complete silence. He takes no food unless directly handed to him and then consumes only enough to sustain life. Most troubling is his new habit of closing his eyes and pressing his palms against his ears when either I or Isaiah attempts to engage him in conversation, as though our voices cause him physical discomfort. Yet I have observed him incline his head toward the walls or windows at times, particularly those facing east toward the bridge, with an expression of intense concentration. Dr. Samuel Parkman, the nearest physician based in Farmington, was summoned on December 22nd. The journey from his practice to the Mercer homestead required nearly 3 hours by horse-drawn buggy under the challenging winter conditions. His medical notes, preserved in the county archives, describe Jacob as physically sound but mentally absent. Patient exhibits no fever or identifiable symptoms of physical distress, but remains unresponsive to verbal stimuli. Pupils react normally to light, pulse, and respiration within acceptable parameters. Diagnosis unclear, possibly nervous exhaustion or early indication of mental deterioration. Dr. Parkman prescribed bed rest and a tonic of valerian root. He also suggested that Elizabeth and Isaiah maintain careful observation and send for him, should Jacob's condition worsen. The doctor's notes include a curious addendum. Patient became briefly animated when I mentioned crossing the bridge to reach their property. His only utterance during my examination was, "It waits there still." When questioned about this statement, he returned to his previous unresponsive state. In a letter to a medical colleague in St. Louis, dated December 27, 1900, discovered among Parkman's effects after his death in 1911, the doctor expressed frustration regarding Jacob's case. "I confess myself perplexed by Mercer's condition. Physical examination reveals no organic cause for his altered state. Were this an isolated case, I might attribute it to particular psychological pressures or perhaps an undiagnosed brain fever. However, I am troubled by the similarity between his symptoms and those I observed in Thomas Holloway some 12 years prior, as well as in 3 other patients from the same geographical area over the intervening period. All exhibited this peculiar fixation on Sutton's crossing and reported auditory phenomena associated with the structure. I begin to wonder whether some environmental factor specific to that location might be responsible, perhaps a mineral emanation from the underlying geological formations affecting the nervous system. The holiday period passed without improvement. Isaiah's journal entries grow increasingly concerned, noting that Jacob now spent hours each night standing on the front porch facing the direction of Sutton's crossing, regardless of weather conditions. On December 28th, Isaiah wrote, "Found. Jay's boots caked with mud this morning, though he was in bed when he and I retired last night. He must be walking to the bridge during the night hours. E wishes to secure him in his room after dark. I have advised against this, fearing it may agitate his already disturbed mind. A particularly disturbing entry from December 29th reads, "Followed J at a distance this evening. He walked directly to the bridge, his path unerring, despite the darkness and accumulation of snow. Upon reaching the center of the crossing, he stood motionless for nearly 40 minutes. From my concealed position, some 50 yards distant, I could observe him occasionally nodding, as though in agreement with some unheard statement. At no point did he speak aloud. His return journey was equally deliberate. He seemed entirely unaware of my presence throughout." On December 30th, Isaiah recorded, "Jay spent the afternoon attempting to reproduce on paper the patterns I had earlier observed him drawing in the barn. He filled 7 pages with increasingly intricate geometric configurations. When E inquired as to their purpose, he did not respond verbally, but placed his hand on the center of one drawing and closed his eyes as though feeling for vibrations. I later examined these papers in his absence and experienced a peculiar visual discomfort when focusing on certain sections. The arrangements of lines seemed to create an optical effect whereby the flat surface appeared to recede into impossible depths." The turning point came on New Year's Eve, 1900. According to both Elizabeth's later statement and Isaiah's journal, Jacob broke his silence during the evening meal. His words, as recorded by Isaiah, were, "It's waiting for someone to listen properly. I've been listening wrong. Tomorrow I'll understand better." Elizabeth's journal provides additional context. Jay spoke for the first time in nearly a fortnight this evening. His voice seemed lower in pitch than formerly, with an unusual cadence to his words. When I expressed relief at hearing him speak again, he looked at me with an expression I found difficult to interpret, something between pity and resignation. He said, "The bridge knows things. It remembers what was there before the wood, before the stone, before us." He would say nothing further on the subject. That night, Elizabeth awoke to find Jacob's side of the bed empty. According to her statement, she initially assumed he had gone to use the outhouse, but became concerned when he did not return within a reasonable time. She woke Isaiah, who confirmed that Jacob was not in the house. Both noted that despite the bitter cold, temperatures that night were later recorded at 7 degrees below zero Fahrenheit, Jacob had taken neither his heavy coat nor gloves, departing in only his nightshirt and boots. The two immediately set out towards Sutton's crossing, carrying lanterns to illuminate the snow-covered path. Their statements regarding what they found there form the central mystery of this case. Upon reaching the bridge shortly after 2 a.m., on January 1st, 1901, Elizabeth and Isaiah reported seeing Jacob standing motionless at the exact center of the crossing. According to both witnesses, he appeared to be engaged in conversation, though no other individual was visible. Elizabeth's statement describes her husband's demeanor as animated in a way I had not observed since early December. His hands moved. In explanatory gestures, his head inclined as though listening, yet no other person was present. As they approached, calling his name, Jacob turned toward them. Both Elizabeth and Isaiah would later describe his expression as one of perfect peace, before he deliberately climbed over the railing. Isaiah's journal, in what would prove to be his final entry, recorded, "His eyes met mine in that moment." What I saw there was not madness or despair, but a terrible clarity, as though he had solved some complex equation and found the answer both inevitable and satisfactory. Isaiah attempted to reach his brother, but was still approximately 30 feet away when Jacob released his grip on the railing. The drop to the partially frozen river below was approximately 60 feet. Despite immediate efforts to locate him, Jacob's body was not recovered that night. Elizabeth's statement indicates that she and Isaiah searched the riverbank for nearly an hour before the extreme cold forced them to return home and summon help with the coming of daylight. A search party organized by Sheriff Doherty combed the river for 3 days following the incident. On January 4, 1901, Jacob's body was discovered nearly a mile downstream, lodged against fallen timber. The official cause of death was recorded as drowning, though the coroner's report noted that significant trauma consistent with impact upon rocks or ice preceded the introduction of water into the lungs. Sheriff Doherty's official report, filed on January 7, 1901, concluded that Jacob Mercer had passed while in a state of mental disturbance brought about by unspecified natural causes. The document makes brief reference to similar incidents in the vicinity, but does not elaborate on this connection. A handwritten note in the margin, apparently added later, reads simply, "Another one at the bridge, third this year." This might have remained a tragic but relatively straightforward case of a life cut short by mental deterioration had it not been for what followed. Isaiah, deeply affected by his brother's departure, became increasingly preoccupied with Sutton's crossing. Elizabeth's statement indicates that he made daily visits to the site, sometimes remaining there for hours despite the harsh winter conditions. Elizabeth's journal entries from this period reveal mounting concern for her brother-in-law's mentally state. On January 9th, she wrote, "I returned from the bridge today with a peculiar light in his eyes. He spoke of patterns in the wood grain of the bridge supports that echo the configurations beneath. When I inquired as to his meaning, he produced Jay's drawings and indicated certain geometric formations, insisting they corresponded to the natural striations in the bridge timbers and, more disturbingly, to formations in the rock face beneath. It's not coincidence, he said. Sutton knew. He designed it to resonate." On January 12th, I spent the entire day at the bridge, returning after nightfall, chilled to the bone, yet seemingly unaware of his physical discomfort. He brought home splinters of wood from the railing, which he examined under a magnifying glass before arranging in patterns similar to those in Jay's drawings. When I suggested he rest, he replied, "There isn't time. It's already speaking to me, too." On January 15th, found I sleepwalking last night. He stood in Jay's former place by the eastern window, swaying slightly, as though keeping time with some inaudible rhythm. When gently awakened, he appeared momentarily confused before stating, "The bridge isn't the cause, it's a symptom." He would not explain further and has no recollection of the incident this morning. On January 18th, 1901, Isaiah approached Cornelius Washburn, editor of the Irondale Register, with what he described as critical information regarding the true nature of the bridge. Washburn, known for his skeptical temperament and journalistic rigor, initially dismissed Isaiah's claims as the delusions of a grieving brother. However, he agreed to accompany Isaiah to the crossing the following day, possibly to gather material for a human interest story on the tragedy. Washburn's personal journal, donated to the Washington County Historical Society by his granddaughter in 1957, contains a detailed account of this visit. According to his entry dated January 19, 1901, he and Isaiah arrived at the bridge shortly after noon. The weather was clear but bitterly cold. Washburn describes Isaiah as agitated but lucid, repeatedly insisting that the editor remain silent and simply listen to the bridge. For nearly 30 minutes, the two men stood in silence. Washburn's journal expresses his growing impatience and concern for Isaiah's mental state. As he was preparing to suggest they return to town, he recorded experiencing what he described as a peculiar acoustic phenomenon. In his words, the sound of the water flowing beneath suddenly altered in character. Rather than the random patterns of natural movement, there emerged what can only be described as rhythmic undulations, almost like articulated speech, though in no language I could identify. The sensation lasted perhaps 20 seconds before dissipating, Washburn continues. I attempted to dismiss the experience as a trick of acoustics combined with the power of suggestion. Mercer, however, appeared vindicated. "You heard it," he said. "No, not clearly yet, but you heard it begin to speak." When I suggested that what we had experienced was merely the result of wind moving through the gorge's unusual configuration, he shook his head with evident disappointment. "You need to listen longer. It takes time to attune your perception." Jacob understood toward the end. Washburn attributed this experience to the combined effects of cold, the natural acoustics of the gorge, and his own suggestibility after listening to Isaiah's theories. He made no mention of this incident in the subsequent article published in the Irondale Register on January 22, 1901, which focused instead on the community's response to Jacob's passing and a brief history of accidents associated with the Bridge. The article, headlined "Local Man's Tragic End Highlights Bridge Safety Concerns," avoided any mention of the unusual circumstances surrounding Jacob's behavior prior to his departure. It did, however, include a paragraph noting that local authorities have long recognized Sutton's Crossing as a site requiring caution, with 17 documented accidents occurring there since its construction in 1879, a figure significantly higher than comparable structures in the county. Isaiah Mercer, however, became increasingly convinced that the bridge itself was somehow sentient or possessed of some malevolent intelligence. According to Elizabeth's later testimony, he began collecting information about previous incidents at the crossing, interviewing longtime residents and consulting county records. By late February 1901, he had compiled substantial documentation suggesting patterns of unusual behavior and unexplained incidents connected to the structure. Elizabeth's journal from February 10th states, "I returned from Farmington today with transcripts from the county records." He spread these across the dining table and spent hours organizing them by date and type of incident. The resulting pattern, he claims, shows a clear correlation between phases of the moon and unusual occurrences at the bridge. More disturbing is his insistence that these incidents have increased in both frequency and severity since the bridge's construction, with the most pronounced escalation occurring in the past decade. On February 17th, she wrote, "I has begun mapping the locations of all homes in the vicinity from which individuals reported unusual experiences connected to the bridge. He believes there exists a pattern of impact radiating outward from the structure, with the severity of effects diminishing in proportion to distance. Our own home," he notes with evident concern, "falls just within what he terms the primary influence zone." By late February, Isaiah had apparently developed a theory regarding the bridge's influence. Elizabeth's entry from February 26th reads, "I spoke at length this evening about resonance frequencies and their effects on human cognition. While much of his explanation exceeded my understanding, he seems to believe that the particular dimensions of the gorge beneath Sutton's Crossing create unusual acoustic properties that can, under certain conditions, affect the human nervous system. The bridge's design," he suggests, "may amplify rather than mitigate these effects." When I inquired whether this was intentional, he replied, "I'm increasingly convinced that Frederick Sutton incorporated specific elements into his design with full awareness of their likely consequences." On March 3, 1901, Isaiah presented his findings to Sheriff Doherty, requesting an official investigation. The sheriff's office visitor log confirms this meeting took place, lasting approximately 45 minutes. No official action was taken, and Doherty later described Isaiah as consumed by grief and searching for meaning in a senseless tragedy. August, Sheriff Doherty's personal notes, discovered among his effects after his retirement in 1912, provide additional context. Mercer presented a disturbing volume of research regarding Sutton's Crossing. While his interpretations tend toward the fantastic, the underlying data he has compiled is difficult to dismiss entirely. The statistical anomalies associated with the bridge, particularly the clustering of mental disturbances among those living within 1 mile of the structure, warrant consideration. However, official investigation seems unlikely to yield actionable results and may only serve to heighten public anxiety. I have advised Mercer to forward his findings to the state university, should he wish them examined by those with appropriate scientific expertise. What is particularly noteworthy about Isaiah's investigation, however, was his discovery of a pattern regarding the bridge's construction. According to county records, the engineer who designed Sutton's crossing, Frederick Sutton, for whom it was named, made several unusual modifications to the standard design during the IHA building process in 1879. These included asymmetrical spacing of support beams and the incorporation of iron elements arranged in patterns that served no apparent structural purpose. The original architectural plans for the bridge, which Isaiah located in the county archives, differed significantly from the final construction. Annotations in Sutton's hand, dated April 1879, call for specific modifications to the initial design, including the addition of iron resonators at precise intervals along the underside of the span. These modifications were implemented despite increasing the project's cost by nearly 18%, suggesting Sutton considered them essential. More significantly, Isaiah uncovered evidence that Sutton himself had exhibited behavioral changes similar to Jacob's following the bridge's completion. According to an article in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, dated November 12, 1879, Sutton was committed to the state lunatic asylum in Fulton after attempting to destroy his own creation. The article quotes him as saying, "The bridge speaks with voices that should not exist." Further research by Isaiah revealed that Sutton had previously designed 6 other bridges across Missouri and Illinois, all of which remained in service without unusual incident. His professional reputation prior to the Irondale project had been exemplary, with county records describing him as methodical to a fault, and possessed of a mathematical precision that ensures structural integrity beyond the common standard. What distinguished Sutton's crossing from his previous work, Isaiah discovered, was its location. The particular geological formation of the gorge, with its unusual acoustic properties, had no parallel in his earlier projects. A geological survey conducted in 1875, which Sutton would have consulted during the design process, specifically noted the peculiar resonant quality of the ravine and recommended any structure spanning it be designed to dampen rather than amplify these natural acoustics. Sutton's design, contrary to this recommendation, incorporated elements that would theoretically enhance the gorge's acoustic properties. The asymmetrical spacing of support beams, the addition of iron resonators, and the specific height of the railings all suggest a deliberate manipulation of sound patterns rather than their mitigation. Elizabeth Mercer's situation deteriorated following these discoveries. Her statement to Reverend Thomas Grayson of the Irondale Methodist Church, recorded in his pastoral journal on April 10, 1901, expresses fear not of Isaiah, but for him. He speaks constantly of vibrations and resonance. He believes Frederick. Sutton discovered something about the relationship between certain structures and human consciousness. I fear he is following the same path that claimed Jacob. Reverend Grayson's journal provides additional context. Mrs. Mercer reports that her brother-in-law now spends most nights at the bridge, returning only briefly during daylight hours to transcribe his observations and consume minimal sustenance. He has developed a practice of pressing his ear directly against the wooden planking at the center of the span, remaining in this position for hours, regardless of weather conditions. Most concerning is his claim that he can now understand fragments of what it's saying, and his belief that complete comprehension requires complete submission. I have offered to speak with him, but Mrs. Mercer believes he would be unreceptive to pastoral counsel at this stage. On April 14th, Elizabeth's journal records a particularly disturbing incident. I returned from the bridge before dawn, his clothing soaked despite the clear night. He moved about the house in a state of evident agitation, gathering his research materials and organizing them meticulously. When I inquired as to his activities, he replied, "It's shown me how the patterns connect, not just at the bridge, but everywhere. The world is structured around frequencies we've been trained not to perceive." He then produced a tuning fork from his pocket and struck it against the table edge, holding it near various objects in the room and nodding as though confirming some private theory. When the fork's vibration faded, he looked at me with an expression of profound sadness and said, "You can't hear it yet. Perhaps that's a mercy." On April 17, 1901, Isaiah Mercer disappeared. Elizabeth reported his absence to Sheriff Doherty the following morning after discovering that his bed had not been slept in. A search of the property revealed that his extensive notes regarding the bridge were missing as well. The most logical assumption, that he had gone to Sutton's Crossing, proved correct. Isaiah's coat was found hanging from the same section of railing from which Jacob had fallen 3.5 months earlier. Unlike his brother, however, Isaiah's body was never recovered. Despite an extensive search covering several miles of the river in both directions, no trace of him was ever found. The official report concluded that the swift current, swollen by spring rains, had likely carried his remains far downstream, possibly as far as the Mississippi River, with which the Big River eventually merges. Sheriff Doherty's report on the Iba disappearance, dated April 25, 1901, contains an unusual personal addendum. Having now lost 2 men to the same location under similar circumstances, I feel compelled to note my growing concern regarding Sutton's Crossing. While official findings must adhere to rational explanation, I cannot dismiss the statistical improbability of these events occurring by chance. I have therefore ordered additional warning signs posted at both approaches to the bridge and have instructed my deputies to increase patrols of the area, particularly after nightfall. Elizabeth Mercer remained in the family home until June 1901, when she sold the property to James Carrington, a distant cousin of her late husband. The bill of sale, preserved in county records, indicates that the transaction occurred at significantly below market value, suggesting Elizabeth's primary motivation was swift departure rather than financial consideration. She relocated to her sister's home in Springfield, Missouri, where she lived until her passing in 1943. According to her sister's descendants, interviewed by historian Margaret Welch in 1965, Elizabeth never again spoke of the events surrounding her husband's departure or her brother-in-law's disappearance. The only exception was a single statement recorded in her sister's diary in 1902. "Lizzie woke screaming again last night. When calmed, she would only say, 'Some bridges aren't meant to be crossed.'" Sutton's Crossing continued to be used despite its reputation until 1917, when a structural assessment found it unsafe for continued use. Rather than repair the aging structure, county officials opted to build a new crossing approximately half a mile upstream. The original bridge was abandoned and eventually collapsed during a severe storm in 1924. Its stone foundations remain visible to this day, though the site is difficult to access due to the rugged terrain. The documentation compiled by Isaiah Mercer has never been recovered. Local legend suggests he destroyed his research before his final departure, though no evidence supports this theory. An alternative account, recorded by folklorist James Westfall in his 1947 collection Ozarks Shadows, claims that Isaiah's notes were discovered by a trapper in 1908, hidden in a waterproof oilskin pouch wedged between rocks near the bridge's foundation. According to Westfall's informant, the contents were so disturbing that the finder burned them immediately. This story, while intriguing, lacks contemporary documentation. The alleged discoverer, identified only as Old Man Carver in Westfall's text, reportedly passed in 1911 without providing a detailed account of the materials he claimed to have found. However, Westfall's research notes, archived at the University of Missouri, include an interview with Carver's son, who recalled his father speaking of drawings that seemed to move when you looked at them directly, and pages of calculations that gave him headaches when he tried to understand them. What elevates this case beyond mere local legend is the statistical anomaly associated with Sutton's Crossing. County records indicate that between 1879 and 1917, the rate of tragic endings for individuals living within a 1-mile radius of the bridge was approximately 8 times the national average. Moreover, psychological disturbances reported in the same area occurred with significantly higher frequency than in comparable rural communities. The Washington County Health Department, established in 1905, maintained records of all medical incidents reported within its jurisdiction. A retrospective analysis of these documents reveals that between 1905 and 1917, physicians documented 47 cases of what they termed nervous disorders among residents living near Sutton's Crossing. The symptoms described show remarkable consistency: initial reports of auditory phenomena, followed by withdrawal from social interaction, obsessive attention to geometric patterns, and eventually, in 39% of cases, expressions of a desire to join with the bridge, as one physician delicately phrased it. Dr. William Harrison, the county health officer from 1908 to 1916, noted this pattern in his annual report of 1912. The clustering of mental disturbances in the vicinity of Irondale, particularly among those residing near Sutton's Crossing, represents a statistical anomaly that warrants further investigation. Environmental factors, possibly related to mineral deposits or water contamination from mining operations, may be contributing to these cases. Harrison's hypothesis regarding mining contamination gained traction among local authorities, who found it a more palatable explanation than alternatives involving the bridge itself. The Palmer Lead Mine, where Jacob Mercer had worked, became the focus of an informal investigation by the Missouri Department of Mining in 1913. Their report, while acknowledging elevated levels of lead in soil samples collected near the operation, found insufficient evidence to establish a causal relationship between mining activities and reported mental disturbances in the affected population. More telling was the geographic distribution of cases. If mining contamination were the primary cause, one would expect the highest concentration of incidents to occur closest to the mining operation itself. Instead, the data showed a clear clustering around Sutton's Crossing, with frequency diminishing in concentric circles moving outward from the bridge, precisely the pattern Isaiah Mercer had identified in his research. In 1914, a particularly disturbing incident added to the bridge's grim reputation. Archival photographs from the Irondale Register show a gathering of approximately 20 local residents at Sutton's Crossing on the evening of June 21st, the summer solstice. According to the accompanying article, these individuals had independently arrived at the bridge shortly after sunset, each claiming to have been drawn by unusual sounds. When questioned by Sheriff Michael Collins, who had succeeded Doherty in 1910, none could provide a coherent explanation for their presence. Most disturbing was the behavior observed by Collins and his deputies. The gathered individuals reportedly stood in complete silence, arranged in a rough semicircle facing the center of the bridge. They remained motionless for nearly 40 minutes before dispersing without communication. When interviewed the following day, none retained clear memory of the event, describing it variously as a momentary impulse or a dreamlike episode. 3 of those identified in the photograph would depart this world within the following 6 months in circumstances eerily similar to Jacob Mercer's. This incident prompted Collins to station deputies at the bridge on a nightly basis throughout the remainder of the summer. No similar gatherings occurred during this period of surveillance. However, deputies assigned to this duty repeatedly requested reassignment, citing discomfort and difficulty maintaining alertness while on the bridge after dark. One deputy, James Wilson, submitted his resignation after a single night of bridge duty, stating only that he could no longer reside in a county that contained such a place. By 1915, local authorities had posted permanent warning signs at both approaches to the bridge, advising travelers not to linger on the structure and to prohibiting crossing after sunset. While these measures reduced reported incidents, they did not eliminate them entirely. Between 1915 and the bridge's eventual abandonment in 1917, county records document 7 additional tragic departures and 12 cases of what one physician described as acoustic delusions specific to the location. The decision to abandon rather than repair Sutton's Crossing came after a structural assessment in early 1917 identified significant deterioration in several key support beams. The county commissioner's report dated March 12, 1917, cites prohibitive repair costs as the primary motivation for constructing a new crossing upstream. However, internal correspondence between commissioners preserved in county archives suggests additional factors influenced this decision. In a letter dated February 28, 1917, Commissioner Thomas Blackwood wrote to his colleagues, "Beyond the structural concerns identified in the engineer's report, I believe we must consider the persistent negative associations with the current bridge. The construction of an entirely new crossing following modern design principles and situated at a different location would serve both practical needs and the less tangible but equally important purpose of severing connection with the troubling history of the existing structure." This sentiment apparently found support among the other commissioners. The motion to abandon Sutton's Crossing and construct a new bridge passed unanimously on March 15, 1917. Work on the new structure began that spring and was completed by October of the same year. Notably, the design incorporated none of the unusual elements present in Sutton's original construction, adhering strictly to standard engineering practices of the period. The original bridge, left to deteriorate naturally, collapsed during a severe storm on April 7, 1924. According to witness accounts published in the Irondale Register, the structure's failure occurred during an unusually intense thunderstorm, accompanied by what one observer described as a sound like metal being torn apart, far louder than mere thunder. The bridge reportedly collapsed not gradually but all at once, as though some tremendous force had pulled it downward from below. In the aftermath of the collapse, several local residents reported a marked change in the atmosphere surrounding the former crossing. Hiram Jenkins, whose farm bordered the eastern approach to the bridge, told the Register, "The air feels lighter somehow. Birds sing in places they wouldn't go near before. It's as though something that was holding its breath for 40 years finally let go." Whether this represented objective reality or merely psychological relief following the destruction of a structure long associated with tragedy remains debatable. What is certain is that documented cases of unusual behavior and psychological disturbances in the vicinity declined dramatically following the bridge's collapse. Between 1924 and 1930, county health records show only 2 cases of mental deterioration within the same geographic area that had previously experienced 8 times the national average. The rates returned to consistency with the broader region. The stone foundations of Sutton's Crossing remain visible to this day, though the site is difficult to access due to the rugged terrain. Vegetation has reclaimed much of the area, with mature trees now growing where the bridge's approaches once stood. The gorge itself, while still impressive in its dimensions, has partially filled with silt over the decades, reducing its depth by nearly 15 feet. The acoustic properties noted in early surveys have likely been altered by these geological changes. Yet even now, local residents maintain a respectful distance from the site. Hunting and fishing, popular activities throughout the Ozarks, are notably absent in the immediate vicinity of the former crossing. When questioned about this pattern, longtime residents typically offer vague responses about better spots elsewhere, or simply change the subject. Few will openly acknowledge the persistent unease associated with the location. In 1963, Dr. Eleanor Pritchard of Washington University in St. Louis conducted a retrospective analysis of the statistical anomalies associated with Sutton's Crossing as part of a broader study on geographical correlation with mental health outcomes. Her findings, published in the Journal of Environmental Psychology, suggested that certain geological formations might create infrasound frequencies below the range of human hearing that can nevertheless affect neurological function. She specifically cited the unique gorge formation beneath Sutton's Crossing as a potential source of such vibrations. Pritchard's research team visited the collapsed bridge site in April 1963. Their equipment recorded unusual acoustic properties in the gorge, including standing wave patterns that created nodes of significantly amplified sound at certain points, one of which corresponded precisely with the center of where the bridge had stood. Her paper speculated that these acoustic anomalies, combined with the bridge's structure, might have created a form of resonance that affected the human nervous system during prolonged exposure. The paper contains a particularly intriguing observation. When test tones of precisely 18.9 Hz were generated at the site, our team experienced a range of subjective effects, including unease, mild disorientation, and in 2 cases, auditory hallucinations described as whispering voices. These effects dissipated immediately upon cessation of the tone. This frequency appears uniquely amplified by the gorge's configuration and may have been further enhanced by the specific dimensions of the original bridge structure. Pritchard's research remains controversial in academic circles. Critics point to methodological limitations and the impossibility of recreating the original conditions of the intact bridge. Her research notes and recordings were archived at Washington University, but were reportedly lost during a storage facility reorganization in 1968. Attempts to replicate her findings with modern equipment have yielded inconsistent results, with some researchers reporting similar acoustic anomalies while others detect nothing unusual. Dr. Pritchard herself declined to pursue further research at the site following her initial study. In a letter to a colleague dated September 1963, she wrote, "While the data collected at Sutton's Crossing suggests fertile ground for continued investigation, I find myself reluctant to return to the location. This reluctance stems not from scientific skepticism, but its opposite, a growing conviction that some phenomena, once identified, are better left unexamined. The patterns we've begun to discern may lead in directions incompatible with academic objectivity. What cannot be disputed is the unusual number of incidents associated with this otherwise unremarkable rural crossing. Between 1879 and 1917, county records document 23 deaths directly connected to the bridge, 17 involving individuals who deliberately stepped from the railing, and 6 accidents. An additional 31 cases of nervous disorders were reported among regular users of the crossing, particularly those who traversed it daily for work purposes. Perhaps most telling is the fate of the bridge's namesake. Frederick Sutton, after his commitment to the Fulton Asylum, was diagnosed with acute melancholia with delusional features. Hospital records indicate that he refused to sleep in rooms, with right angles claiming that certain geometric configurations created doorways in the mind. He remained institutionalized until his passing in 1885, reportedly from self-inflicted starvation, after claiming that food had become contaminated with bridge thoughts. During his 6 years of confinement, Sutton produced hundreds of pages of writings and drawings. According to asylum records, these materials demonstrated an obsessive preoccupation with mathematical relationships between sound, structure, and human consciousness. The attending physician, Dr. James Hollister, noted that Sutton's calculations, while appearing delusional in content, exhibited a coherence and internal consistency, suggesting methodical rather than chaotic thought processes. Most of Sutton's asylum writings were destroyed in a fire that damaged the facility's east wing in 1894. However, 16 pages survived, preserved by Dr. Hollister, who had removed them for study shortly before the fire. These fragments, now housed in the Missouri State Archives, provide disturbing insights into Sutton's thinking during his confinement. One passage, dated October 1880, reads, "The bridge was merely a prototype, an experiment to confirm what I had theorized but could not prove without practical application. The results exceeded my expectations in ways both fascinating and terrible. I now understand that certain configurations of matter can serve as conduits for frequencies typically inaccessible to human perception. The implications extend far beyond civil engineering." Another fragment, apparently part of a letter never sent, states, "What we perceive as solid matter is merely organized vibration, maintaining particular patterns through time." By introducing specific counter-vibrations at calculated points, one can create interference patterns that disrupt the conventional relationship between consciousness and physical reality. The bridge demonstrates this principle on a small scale. Larger applications would yield proportionally greater effects. The most disturbing of the surviving documents is a detailed drawing of what appears to be a modified version of Sutton's crossing, incorporating additional elements not present in the actual construction. Annotations beside this drawing suggest that this enhanced design would amplify the effect by an order of magnitude and potentially establish permanent conduits rather than temporary apertures. The most disturbing aspect of the Sutton's crossing case is not the documented incidents themselves, but the consistent pattern in victims' behavior. In almost every instance where records exist, individuals exhibited the same progression: initial fascination followed by withdrawal and silence, culminating in an apparent compulsion to return to the bridge during nighttime hours. Those who survived this final stage universally reported hearing voices or music emanating from the structure itself. Modern explanations range from mass hysteria to environmental toxins. The Palmer Lead mine, where Jacob Mercer worked, has been suggested as a possible source of heavy metal contamination that could induce neurological symptoms. However, this theory fails to account for the geographical specificity of the incidents and their cessation following the bridge's abandonment. A 1998 geological survey conducted by the Missouri Department of Natural Resources identified unusual concentrations of specific minerals in the rock formation surrounding the former bridge site. These minerals, primarily magnetite and certain rare earth elements, can exhibit piezoelectric properties, generating electrical charges when subjected to mechanical stress. Some researchers have suggested that the combination of these minerals with the gorge's acoustic properties might have created electromagnetic fields capable of affecting brain activity, particularly in the temporal lobes associated with auditory processing. This hypothesis, while intriguing, remains speculative. The technology to precisely measure and map such fields in natural settings has only recently become available, and no comprehensive study of the Sutton's crossing site using these new methods has been conducted. Given the significant changes to the landscape over the past century, including siltation of the gorge and natural weathering of the exposed rock faces, contemporary measurements might not accurately reflect conditions during the bridge's operational period. In 1965, during construction of a flood control project near the original bridge site, workers uncovered a peculiar artifact embedded in one of the remaining foundation stones. Described in the project engineer's report as a metal object of indeterminate origin, it was approximately 6 inches in length, cylindrical, and covered with markings that resembled mathematical equations. The object was sent to the University of Missouri for analysis, but reportedly disappeared en route. No photographs or detailed drawings were preserved. Project supervisor Raymond Thornton provided the only detailed description of the object in a statement to the Irondale Register. It appeared to be made of some unusual alloy, lighter than steel but with similar hardness. The surface was covered with intricate engravings, primarily geometric patterns, and what looked like mathematical formulas. Most striking was a series of concentric circles at one end, arranged in a pattern that created an optical illusion of depth. The overall impression was of something designed with extraordinary precision for some specific purpose, though that purpose was not immediately apparent. Thornton further noted that the object had been discovered in a cavity that appeared to have been deliberately created within the foundation stone, rather than resulting from natural weathering or structural failure. This suggests intentional placement during the bridge's construction, raising questions about its purpose and who might have embedded it within the structure. Frederick Sutton's surviving papers contain no reference to incorporating such an object into his design. However, given that the majority of his professional and personal documents were destroyed following his commitment to the asylum, the absence of documentation does not preclude his involvement. The precision engineering suggested by Thornton's description would be consistent with Sutton's known technical abilities. Today, the site of Sutton's Crossing is largely forgotten. The new bridge, built in 1918 and widened in 1956, carries occasional local traffic with no reported incidents. The gorge below has partially filled with silt, reducing its depth by nearly 15 feet. The acoustic properties, noted by Dr. Pritchard's team in 1963, have likely been altered by these geological changes. Yet local residents still avoid the area after dark. The descendants of those who lived near the original bridge maintain a respectful distance from the subject when questioned by outsiders. As recently as 1968, a survey conducted by the Washington County Historical Society found that 87% of respondents from Irondale and the surrounding area believed the original bridge site remained unwholesome or best left undisturbed. This persistent wariness spanning multiple generations suggests a cultural memory more resilient than typical rural superstitions. When pressed for specifics, older residents often refer to family stories of the troubles at the bridge, or simply advise that some places don't sit right with the natural order. Few will elaborate beyond these vague admonitions, particularly to those perceived as outsiders. In 1977, a graduate student in folklore studies from the University of Missouri attempted to conduct recorded interviews with residents regarding the bridge's history. According to his field notes archived at the university library, he encountered consistent resistance. Subjects who had previously spoken freely about other local legends and superstitions became noticeably reticent when Sutton's Crossing was mentioned, he wrote. Several terminated interviews immediately, while others changed the subject or provided only minimal responses. The impression conveyed was not of ignorance, but deliberate withholding of information. What truly happened at Sutton's Crossing? Was it merely a convergence of geological peculiarities, environmental factors, and psychological suggestion? Or did Frederick Sutton, through either accident or design, create a structure that somehow interacted with human consciousness in ways science has yet to fully comprehend? The answers, like Isaiah Mercer's body and research, remain lost to time. The collapsed remnants of the bridge slowly decay, reclaimed by the Ozark wilderness. The stone foundations stand as mute witnesses to whatever truths might lie behind the legend of the gateway to hell. Perhaps some bridges, as Elizabeth Mercer suggested, truly aren't meant to be crossed, not physically, but in our understanding. Some mysteries, once encountered, change those who investigate them in ways that can never be undone. In the deep hollows of the Ozarks, where silence gathers like mist, Sutton's Crossing remains one such enigma, a threshold between the known and the inexplicable that continues to resist our attempts to categorize or dismiss it. And sometimes, late at night, when the wind falls still, locals say the gorge still seems to whisper, not with the random patterns of natural movement, but in rhythmic undulations, almost like articulated speech, though in no language anyone can identify. Some say it's merely water over stone, others aren't so certain, and no one stands at the center of the new bridge after dark. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Support us for more content like this.